Welcome to the Empowered Catholic Podcast with Karen and Curtis Herbert, where we combine the best of theology, science, and coaching to inspire your empowerment. It's our mission to help you release the inner obstacles that are holding you back from embracing true Christian freedom, so the power of the Holy Spirit can manifest in you. So if you believe that God has more for you, if you want to believe that God has more for you, listen on, my friend. Hello, and welcome to the Empowered Catholic Podcast. You're here with Karen and Curtis Herbert.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be here with you. Karen, we had a listener come up, and I was talking to him, and I think it was episode 161 he was listening to, and he said, Curtis, I really liked how you said, when you're listening without judgment, we're not suspending moral judgment. We're not taking a pass on poor behavior. What we're trying to do is simply not judge, not assume that we know where the other person is coming from. We're trying to set aside our preformed opinions. And I think that really landed with him. He must have heard somewhere that you have to listen without judgment. And that was simply a helpful clarification.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Curtis. Today, we are continuing with our Empowered Relationship season, and I'm pretty excited about the topics today, Curtis.
Yeah, this is really in your wheelhouse.
Well, Curtis, I'm wondering, have you ever noticed that other people think and act differently than you do?
Boy, I can't help but notice that's the case. And I wonder, what are they thinking? How could they possibly think that's suitable?
Why do they do it that way? Yes, if you're a listener and you're married, you may have noticed that you and your spouse respond differently in exactly the same situation. Have you ever noticed that? I've noticed that. Or maybe you're doing a project with someone, maybe someone on your team in your workplace, and they want to jump right in and get to all the details, and you want to just get a handle on the big picture conceptually so you know really where you're going.
All right, this resonates. I want to see the big picture. I need to kind of visualize the finished thing in my mind to start with.
Yeah. And here's something else, Curtis. When you and I encounter a situation, I have noticed that you like to size the situation up quickly, make a quick decision, act, and move on. And I, on the other hand, I like to stop. I like to look at the possible alternatives, get a better handle on the situation, think about the consequences.
Well, actually, Karen, you like to look at all the possible options and all the details of all the possible options.
Well,
and you like to stop. That's an important part of the process. Let's stop. Consider all the possibilities.
And Curtis just says, I don't understand why we have to have a process about anything. Let's just act and move on.
Well, I tell you what, Karen, a lot of planning sometimes is not helpful because many plans are possible to succeed. It's execution that is often controls our destiny. So there. Just bear that in mind.
You can probably tell, listener, that we have been around and around this issue several times in our marriage. And these are different ways in which really we're sorting through the information that's available to us and responding. They're what we call metaprograms. They're patterns of how we're responding to information that comes to us. And we all are going to sort information in our own way. Given the same inputs, each of us is going to think and feel and behave differently and approach things differently, and different things will matter to us.
What's interesting about this is these metaprograms, they are usually unconscious for us until somebody points them out. And you can say, oh, of course, we all do things in a different way. And that seems all so obvious. And so all we're going to get together and we're going to compare notes. Yet what happens in reality is we're trying to get something done, and I can't figure out what you're doing over there. It makes no sense to me because I haven't considered that you have this entirely different approach that it's never really occurred to me.
Yeah. And I think you're right about the unconsciousness of the patterns. We've just been running them in our neurology for a really long time. So we don't even think about them even. And if we do, we might consider them as, part of the personality of the person. They're just these well-traveled highways that keep getting carved out by repeated behavior. And we have a lot of these. We have a lot of patterns that we run, and these higher level patterns or metaprograms are going to show up in a lot of different situations.
I think one of the big takeaways here is that we are all often running unconscious metaprograms for how we approach things. And if we become aware of that, then we get into these situations and we can try to have a little more perspective and figure out, okay, what is it that they're trying to do here? And how can we learn to collaborate?
Very often, you really need different people in the room for a project, a task, a situation who are running different programs and looking at things differently. It can be super helpful. At the same time, one of a metaprogram example is, do I tend to be proactive or do I tend to be reactive? I probably have a tendency towards one of those poles in terms of my metaprogram. And also, different situations are going to call for different things. And if I'm intentional and conscious enough, I can step a little bit out of my preferred processing mode to say, well, what is it the situation calls for and how can I best respond?
That's interesting. I'm thinking about being proactive versus reactive. It's true that there's different areas where I have one or the other approach, but usually it's one or the other.
Right, exactly. So metaprograms are super interesting. They came up in the whole development of neuro-linguistic programming, which is one of the certifications Curtis and I have and some of the trainings that we teach. And a gal named, Elizabeth Myers-Briggs, I think, took 4 very influential metaprograms and created an assessment because these are 4 metaprograms that influence behavior.
Can I just break in?
Yeah.
NLP is an empirical science. It's based on certain ideas, and there's a lot of trial and error. And what works is really important in NLP. And Myers-Briggs it's based on an empirical science. And it's not true when people tell you there's no science behind it.
Do they say that sometimes?
Yeah, it's not like it's deduced from first principles like Aristotelian logic.
Right.
And I can't pronounce that word, don't make me. However, it is deduced from observation and some trial and error. And that's why it's useful.
Right. And the whole idea is what's helpful, particularly in NLP, what's helpful in communication. And I think the unfortunate thing about how we approach some of those assessments, though, is we start to think that they're set in stone.
Oh, right.
Right? That, well, that's your personality. That's just how you are. And one of the things I really love that NLP appreciates is, well, actually, these are things you're doing. They're programs you're running. They're patterns you have. They're not set in stone and unchangeable. It's not really who you are. It's something that you're doing, and you could do it differently. I know plenty of people who have noticed over time from life experience, from situations, from intentional choices, their quote unquote scores on things like the Myers-Briggs assessment have changed, and they have started to do things differently.
So it could be, Karen, that as time passes, you'll learn to do things differently.
Yeah.
And you won't stop. All the options.
You don't think that we have changed in that particular metaprogram over time? You and I?
I'm not sure. However, it's certainly true that we can change and learn to appreciate what the other person is doing.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like we've both, just from being married, have shifted in our approach in certain situations based on what's called for.
Sure, that makes sense.
Okay, so can I just give a couple examples
Yeah.
of what these look like? We're not really going to do the Myers-Briggs categories because those are pretty standard. A lot of people know about them. There's a couple of really interesting ones, though. Like, for example, some people tend to be more internally motivated versus externally motivated.
Okay, so what do you mean by that?
Well, some people are very quickly self-motivated. They don't need as much external direction. They have kind of like this internal measurement around, well, what does success look like? And what are my standards? And they can tell internally if they've met their standards, if they've done a good job. They probably don't care so much about what other people think or need external feedback or guidance because they just have their own yardsticks that they're going by.
They have their own yardsticks, perhaps their own ideas about what the successfully completed project looks like.
Exactly. So this is an employee, for example, who may not need a ton of guidance and may not really like a lot of direction and feedback in their work.
Right. So you're trying to interject yourself into their process because you want some intermediate feedback, and they might not appreciate it because you're kind of interfering with what they're working on.
Yeah, exactly. Or maybe you have an externally motivated person. Well, that's a person who actually needs more feedback, guidance, direction. They want you to lay out the standards for them, tell you the procedures, clarify what success looks like. They're going to need you to tell them when they're doing a good job.
Lots of feedback is very helpful for them. They want to know that they're on track.
Yeah. So they're going to be more communicative about what they're doing, more concerned about how it's integrating with other people. And, you know, if you happen to be a manager, you're going to supervise these two kinds of people in very different ways because different kinds of approaches are going to be annoying and irritating to them.
Well, ideally, you will supervise them in different ways. You'll recognize how they're motivated in these terms, and you'll kind of collaborate with them to have the most efficient process. However, often what actually happens is we are one or the other of those kinds of internally or externally motivated person. And if our employee is the opposite kind, we think there's something wrong with that employee. We think they perhaps lack competence, or they lack focus, or they need a lot of direction, something like that. We're making value judgments about their performance when the reality is they simply work with a different metaprogram than we do. And often, because these metaprograms are unconscious, as a manager, maybe it just never occurred to us that, hey, some people really need a lot of feedback to keep going.
Well, it's true. I think we could sort of have two different poles. Like, on the one hand, we might think, well, everybody should just do it the way I do it and need what I need. And maybe over time, we might realize, oh, well, some people need more feedback. And then our approach might be, well, I'm just going to make a rule that this is the kind of feedback and supervision and direction I give. And that might seem like progress, and it's not very individualized to the person. So I think management in this way, you really do want to individualize versus having some really strict structure about what you're doing.
That really makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it kind of makes me think about, raising kids. Each kid is different and you can't treat them all exactly the same, and they're motivated in different ways and by different things. Another metaprogram that we have is whether we're like a large chunk person or a small chunk person? Are we detail oriented and specific, or do we like to go big picture and see the whole and really conceptualize things at the big picture level? This usually is fairly obvious, I think, when you're starting a project with someone. Are they going to get right to the detail questions, or do they want to step back and take a look at the whole thing first? So if you're a detail-focused person, then you're the person who likes the small logical steps in something. You like to know the specifics. You're the person who actually reads the small print to figure out what's going on and what you need to know. And they want some more detailed specification. And these people are so great. I mean, they're going to dot the I's and cross the T's and make sure something actually gets finished. And they're also going to be fairly in the weeds sometimes, in the details, and need a little help coming up for the bigger picture.
Right, Karen. I think I'm the opposite, and this probably contributes to the reason I'm proactive in a lot of situations. I want to look at the really big picture and kind of go from there without getting stuck down in all the details, which really, can't they be worked out later, preferably by somebody else who's
They're
cleaning
super
up
boring
behind
for
me?
you. Yeah.
Yeah. I've noticed, Karen, we've laughed because we've worked for people that are really the big chunk people. And the really big chunk leaders, they have these big ideas and they initiate them. And they just leave this trail of things to be cleaned up behind them.
Yes.
They're followed. It's like you have these little people cleaning up after the elephants, working out all the details.
Like, that's a great idea. And have you considered what that's going to mean for me and the person next to me, and the
That's
person
right.
down the hall, and what we're going to have to do?
That's right. So it is fascinating. And as a big chunk person, I expect things to work for me. I want your consumer products, for instance, to work for me, the big chunk person. So when I open up the water pick, which is frankly a pretty simple device, I expect the pieces to fit together in a very obvious way, very quickly, because reading the directions is so pointlessly tedious. And you may not have noticed, Karen, but in fact, this is what happened when I bought a water pick system at Costco. I started to unpack it, and it's been sitting there for a while.
Yes.
Weeks, but
I did notice that.
A little while. And the point is that those people that design that stuff, they really should make it for the big chunk people, because after all, are the important ones.
Well, it does make you wonder, like, if you have some really detailed, specific people working on those projects, I see how they could get really into all of the little things that it does. And at some point, you lose connection with, well, what's the overall experience that the person is supposed to have?
The overall consumer experience. Yeah, so product design is fascinating, and that's a great point.
Yeah. Yeah, so people like you, Curtis, you're into the big, broad strokes. You're going to focus on the overall direction. And as I'm hearing you talk, yeah, the details are going to be super frustrating and boring for you. So one way, Curtis, I think this is very helpful for relationships is just the very practical recognition that none of these ways is better than another. And I think we just assume at this unconscious level, well, this is the way I do it. It's got to be the way it should be done. This is what works for me. This is what I'm drawn to. This is what's easier for me. And then we look at somebody else and we're just like, well, we judge them in some way for how they're processing the information. And really having a better sense of all the different kinds of patterns that we can be running in our neurology at any one time, none is better or worse. They're simply how we process information. That's
right, Karen. And this goes back to our listeners' comment about judgment. at the very start of it. The more we can simply dispense with judging the competence or capability or outlook or any of that, the better off we are in our communications and ultimately in building our relationships.
Yeah. And there's lots of things I can make it mean that somebody else isn't interested in the details, or somebody else really doesn't give me the feedback that I need. I can make that mean a lot of things that it probably doesn't mean.
Karen, do you know who Tony Robbins is?
I feel like I've heard that name before. Yes.
Yeah,
of
course.
Of course I know who he is.
He leads these big retreats. There's a lot of excitement. It's glitzy and glamorous. There's kind of jumping up and down. And I was explaining the leadership weekends to some men recently, and I said, you know, Tony Robbins, we're like Tony Robbins for kind of normal people.
I think that's really fun. Yeah.
It is actually true. Tony uses some NLP techniques.
Oh, yeah. He was very trained in NLP.
That's right. And we have those techniques, and we have other better techniques because our process takes the time with people. And in this weekend, we are creating transformations in an area of life where you're not making the progress that you've wanted for a long time. And the weekends they're really for any area of life. We tend to describe them in terms of career and workplace, yet in family life, in primary relationships like marriage, in physical health.
Oh, yeah. There's
personal
leadership
growth
in all
and
of
development.
That. Yep.
All these areas, you can bring your thing to the weekend. You can expect a transformation because once you start to just release that baggage, stop running those patterns that you sense they're holding you back. You're running them, and why are you not making the progress? Bring those things and you'll have a great experience. People come and they love these things. If you're wondering if your thing is suitable for the weekend, reach out. Go to empowercatholics.com, send us an email, send us a text, schedule a quick chat. We'd be more than happy to talk to you for a few minutes about what's going on with you. So we'd love to see you. Give us the dates, Karen.
Yep, April 25th through 27, 2025.
Yeah, it'll be so much fun, you guys. We'll see you later. Thank you for being here with us this week. Visit our website at empoweredcatholics.com to learn more about us. And remember, as Pope Francis says, God comes to break open everything that keeps you closed in.